As we stressed in a previous sequence, when we assess risk, we realize that one of our problems, one of the big issues, arises from our own imperfect information. As humble policy economists, we simply don't have a crystal ball as part of our toolkit. Okay, so this absence of a crystal ball has been especially evident in the attempts to forecast economic growth over the medium term in recent years, and no one has been immune from the possibility of being overly optimistic, not even the research department of the International Monetary Fund. So here's a figure that illustrates precisely this point, and this figure comes from the IMF's own World Economic Outlook, or WEO. Here you can see different lines that shows the research department's viewpoint on the world's GDP from the perspective of what we call different forecast vintages. So this blue line shows us how the IMF world viewed world GDP over the period 2007 through 2013 from the vantage point of fall 2007, okay? So now as the red line shows, 1 year later, in the fall of 2008, the view on world GDP was considerably more pessimistic. And that's as reflected in this red line that lies below the blue line. However, in the intervening years, we received more new and sobering information regarding the world GDP line. And the line had to be revised downward even more. And it had to be revised several times. In fact, the yellow line is not anymore a forecast, but an estimate using the data available as of the fall of 2014. And this is pretty much our estimate of what actually happened. So as we can see, even for the IMF, it is possible to be overly optimistic on growth, and for years and years in a row. So in this course, we have introduced some tools that might help us envisage, from a structural perspective, economic growth going into the future. We've given you some very simple analytical frameworks, and for the most part, we've applied them to historical data. Then, if the future turns out to be in some sense an extension of the past, we might be able to take a reasonable view on what happens in the future. However, we're often wrong. In hindsight, our view of the future could turn out to be excessively optimistic, or perhaps pessimistic, more than it should have been. So we've had a good example of this that we discussed in one of the opening modules, and that's the economic growth issue, using the growth decomposition. So let's go back to that example. Let's revisit the same country in that module, which we called country X. So regarding the historical record of economic growth in country X, we found that over the whole period 2000 through 2016, the average growth rate to be about 4%. But that growth rate was declining over the period. And for that final sub-period, which covered 2011 through 2016, that had fallen to about 3%. So here, our supply side determinants of growth, if we look at those growth rates of capital, labor, and total factor productivity, we found out that as output growth fell, both TFP and also the growth rate of capital also correspondingly fell. We find that, for example, in that last sub-period, the capital stock growth fell down to a paltry 3.8%, which was much lower than, let's say, the 7.4% that we saw at the beginning of the 21st century. While TFP growth fell from over 2% here in 2007 to about 0.7%. Interestingly, we also found that employment grew at a more robust rate, at about 1.7%. So it might be reasonable to think that in the coming years, we should see growth in country X to be on the order of 3% per year. We're not trying to be very exact here. This is not a forecasting course, and we'd be foolish if we thought that we knew the exact number. But we might simply extrapolate past patterns from the most recent sub-period, 2011 through 2016. We could argue that doing so embeds some conservative assumptions. We're not assuming the higher rates of growth of either capital or TFP that we saw previously. Instead, we're we're assuming that the near future is going to look a bit more like the recent past, with its more moderate rates of capital and TFP growth. So yes, it would appear as if we're taking a very cautious view, especially with regarding capital and TFP. And this cautious view, we could argue, is bringing us to this cautious conclusion that a number like 3% growth in the near future is not unreasonable. It's not an unreasonable best guess. But again, we don't really know. It's quite possible that the growth of capital, which had been slowing in the recent past, could slow down even more. And remember that for every 1% reduction in the growth of capital, holding all else equal, the growth of capital will slow by capital share times that 1%. In that previous module, we assumed that capital share was a number we called alpha, 0.3. That means if capital growth were to slow, let's say from the observed 3.8% per year down to 2.8%, that fact alone would push down output from 3 to 2.7%. But we also might argue that we're not being very conservative on our number of unemployment. The growth rate for 2011 to 2016 of 1.7 was in fact higher than the previous period. In fact, that high growth in part reflected increases in the growth of the working age population, as well as growth in both the labor force participation rate and the employment rate. Often, the working age population can surge up for a short period of time as a result of a previous baby boom. That is, as babies which were born about 20 years ago are now just entering the working age population and are perhaps graduating from college, there would also be a growth rate in the employment. But that's going to be a one-time phenomena. That may not be sustained. So suppose that the growth rate of employment falls back by 1% from 1.7 to 0.7. In this case, we know that our rate of economic growth will suffer by 1% times labor share, which we assume to be 0.7. In this case, our 3% growth would drop to 2.3%. As I'm sure you'll agree, these differences in capital and labor growth can have important impacts on GDP growth. On top of that, total factor productivity growth also is very hard to predict. And finally, we need to recognize that the degree of uncertainty is substantial regarding the values of capital share and labor share of GDP. In many countries, the evidence suggests that the former has been rising at the expense of the latter. And in a related vein, when we predict total factor productivity, we are often building in an assumption that recommended structural reforms will be implemented and they will have the desired impact. Again, despite the best intentions, such policy measures can remain unimplemented, or they're implemented, but their beneficial impact may fall short of expectations. So our bottom line here is, once again, we don't have a crystal ball. Our information is uncertain. The future may behave very differently from the past. So let's go forward cautiously but bravely as we examine other risks and vulnerabilities.